The Simpsons has run for more than 35 years, and people still call it a harmless family cartoon. Just jokes, just a yellow dad falling down. But the Catholic League filed formal protests, a Russian church got an episode pulled, and Fox once ordered the writers to stop naming one religion. In this video, we break down 100 times The Simpsons was offensive to the church. The Sunday He Stayed Home, October 8, 1992. Fox airs an episode where the main character quits religion, invents his own, and then talks God into signing off on it. The episode is Homer the Heretic, written by George Meyer, directed by Jim Reardon, third episode of season 4. Up to that point, The Simpsons had been sitting in a church pew every week for 3 seasons, and nobody on screen had ever asked why. This episode asked. It starts small, freezing outside. Homer's pants came out of the wash still wet. The car is buried. He decides he is not going, and Marge takes the kids without him. Nothing more than that. A man stays home from church one time. What the writers do with those 22 minutes is where the trouble starts, because the show does not treat it as a small thing, and it does not treat it as a sin. It treats it as the best decision Homer Simpson has ever made, and it spends the next act proving it. For a lot of people watching with their families that night, the joke landed somewhere other than funny. The episode aired on a Sunday. Families came home from church, sat down, and watched a cartoon spend 22 minutes explaining why the morning they had just spent was optional. The reason he gives Marge is what comes next. Half of every Sunday, Homer the Heretic, October 1992. Homer has skipped church for the first time in his life, and Marge comes home and tells him he has to go back. Homer says no, and the reason he gives is the part that stuck. He does not want to spend half of every Sunday listening to a man explain how he is going to end up in hell. Nobody wrote that as a joke about a lazy man, and here it was, on network television in the Family Hour, coming out of the most popular cartoon character in America. He keeps going. He asks what the harm is in worshiping God his own way, in his own house, without somebody standing over him telling him how to do it. Marge does not have an answer ready. Neither does the show. For most of the episode, nobody argues back, and the argument just sits there. What makes it worse for the church is that Homer is not being clever. He has not read anything or thought about it. He is repeating the most obvious complaint available, the one anybody could arrive at while lying in bed on a cold morning, and nobody in Springfield has a ready answer for the obvious complaint. Plenty of viewers had heard that exact reasoning from somebody in their own family. Hearing it come out of Homer Simpson, framed as reasonable, was the first sign that this episode was not going to wrap up with him learning his lesson. Next, we cover what the show does with him once nobody is watching. Section 3, the best day of his life. The choice that turned complaints into letters comes in the middle of Homer the Heretic, and it happens while nobody is watching him. Homer does not feel guilty. He has a wonderful time. He cranks the heat up. He dances around the living room in his underwear. He finds a penny behind the couch cushions. He makes his own waffles, wraps them in a stick of butter, and eats the whole thing. He watches a football game he would have missed. He gets to do every small pointless thing he never gets to do because Sunday morning belongs to somebody else. The animation treats it like a montage of pure joy. The music swells. Nothing goes wrong. Church attendance in most religious households is not optional, and the argument for it is that skipping costs a person something. This episode shows a man skipping and being rewarded for it, and it films that reward like a miracle. Nobody is arguing God is fake here. The claim is smaller and more irritating. The morning is nicer at home, which for a lot of parents watching was the more annoying claim of the two, and it never gets taken back. He does not get food poisoning. He does not miss anything important. The fire comes later, for an unrelated reason the episode is careful to establish. The day itself stands unpunished. Then a visitor turns up in that living room. Section 4, the only character, with 5 fingers. Halfway through Homer the Heretic, in October 1992, Homer falls asleep on the couch, and God walks into the Simpson living room. Not a light, not a voice from a cloud. God, standing on the carpet, tall, bearded, in a robe, having a conversation with a man in his underwear about his church attendance. People caught a detail in that design immediately. Every human being drawn on The Simpsons has 4 fingers on each hand. Standard cartoon shortcut, and the show has never broken it. God has 5. That was deliberate. The animators gave him the extra finger to mark him as the one figure in the show who is not one of us. Some religious viewers took that as a sign of genuine respect, a small piece of reverence hidden in a comedy. Others got stuck several steps earlier because a Fox cartoon had drawn God at all, given him a body, and put him in a room with Homer Simpson. Whatever the extra finger meant, it did not solve that problem for them. Notice how rarely the show breaks that rule. 35 years of characters, thousands of them, and the four-finger convention holds for every single human being who has ever appeared. The one exception is God, which means the writers built a piece of theology into the character model sheet and then never mentioned it again. Coming up, what God actually says about the sermons. Section 5. God is not a fan of the sermons. Either God is standing in Homer's living room, in Homer the Heretic, and Homer uses the opportunity to complain about church, and God agrees with him. He tells Homer he is not exactly crazy about the sermons himself. He mentions, more or less in passing, that he sometimes thinks about wiping the whole thing out and starting over from scratch. Look at the shape of that scene for a second. A man skips church, God shows up to discuss it, and instead of correcting him, God complains about the service too, like a coworker griping about a long meeting. Sharper than anything Homer says in the episode, because Homer's opinion can be dismissed. He is an idiot. The show has spent years establishing that. God's opinion cannot be dismissed inside the world of the story, since in Springfield, God is real, God is present, and God is standing right there saying it. The writers gave the strongest anti-church argument in the episode to the one character nobody in the audience could argue with, and he is not written as a fraud or a trick. This is not a demon in disguise or a hallucination revealed later. The show commits to it. Inside the world of Springfield, that was God, in the room, agreeing that the sermons are too long. Homer asks for one more thing, and he gets it. Section 6. Permission granted. Near the end of that living room conversation in Homer the Heretic, Homer asks God for what he actually wants, which is permission to skip church and worship in his own way, at home, on his own schedule. God says yes. No catch, no lesson, no fine print. The creator of the universe looks at a man who wants to stay in bed on Sunday and tells him that is fine. For anybody who grew up being told that showing up was not negotiable, that scene is the whole problem in 20 seconds. Every argument a parent has ever made about getting the family in the car, every sermon about the importance of gathering together, gets waved off by God himself in a cartoon living room. The show could have played it as Homer misremembering a dream. It does not. The conversation is treated as having happened. Homer walks out of it with permission, and he behaves for the rest of the episode like a man holding a signed note. The joke works. That is exactly why it stung, and nothing later in the episode revokes it. God never comes back to add conditions. Homer is not punished for the arrangement. Whatever else happens to him over the next 20 minutes, the permission he was granted in that living room stands for the rest of the story and is never mentioned again. Up next, what he builds with that permission. Section 7. The Church of Homer. Homer Simpson founded a religion in October 1992 in the 4th season episode Homer the Heretic, and he was its only member. He declares himself the founder. He is also the only member. The holy day is whatever day he feels like it being. The rules are, without exception, things he already wanted to do. Homer is the target. Anybody watching can see he has invented a religion whose only commandment is to do nothing. The uncomfortable part is that the show lets it work for a while. Homer is happy. He is relaxed. Meanwhile, the people going to church are not having a good time at all. Marge is anxious. Ned Flanders is sick with worry about his neighbor's soul. Lovejoy is annoyed. The man who left is fine, and the people who stayed are miserable. The show never draws attention to that scorekeeping, but it runs underneath the whole second act. By the time the story turns, the audience has watched a made-up religion beat an organized one on points for about 10 straight minutes. The rules he invents are the funniest part. No scripture, no obligation, no requirement to be anywhere at any particular time. He has built a religion around removing every demand that a religion normally makes, and Homer cannot understand why anybody would choose the other kind. Still ahead, the fire nobody saw coming. Section 8. The house burns down. Homer falls asleep with a lit cigar, and the house catches fire. Religious viewers usually point here when they defend the episode. Finally, consequences. The man who quit church nearly dies in a fire, which reads like the story correcting itself. Look at who pulls him out. Ned Flanders, a Christian, drags him from the burning building. Krusty the Clown, who is Jewish, helps fight the fire. Apu Nahasapima Petalon, who is Hindu, is right there with them. Homer's own church does not save him. His neighbors do, and they belong to 3 different religions. The show's actual argument sits there, and it is a generous one. Faith counts for something here because of what it makes people do for each other, not because of which building they sit in on Sunday. This is also the one moment where the writers hand something real to religious viewers. These neighbors ran into a burning house house for a man who had spent the week mocking everything they believe, and the show does not undercut it with a joke, it just lets it happen. It also quietly removes any special claim the church down the street had on the outcome. The fire gets put out by a committee of everybody, and the point of the scene is that the labels did not matter. Then Lovejoy finds a word for everybody else's religion. Section 9. Christian, Jew, or miscellaneous. The last scene of Homer the Heretic belongs to Reverend Lovejoy, who arrives to explain what the fire meant. He tells Homer that God was not punishing him with the fire. God was working through the hearts of his neighbors, whether they happened to be Christian, Jewish, or, in the Reverend's own words, miscellaneous. Miscellaneous. Apu, standing right there, objects. He points out there are 700 million Hindus in the world, and that being filed under leftovers is not much of a compliment. Lovejoy brushes it off and keeps talking. That exchange lasts about 8 seconds, and it does more damage to the character than any episode built around him. A Christian minister sorts every religion outside his own into a junk drawer, gets called on it by a member of one of the largest faiths on earth, and simply does not care enough to adjust. Anybody who has sat in a pew and heard a version of that from the front of a room recognized it instantly. That recognition is exactly why it was funny, and exactly why some viewers did not laugh. The casual delivery is what does the damage. Lovejoy is not sneering. He is being warm, in his own way, trying to comfort Homer. The dismissal of every other faith on earth arrives inside a kind gesture, which is exactly how that attitude usually arrives in real life. How the whole thing ends. Next. Section 10. He falls asleep in the pew. Homer the Heretic ends the way most sitcoms end, with the man who walked away going back to church. That sounds like a win for the Reverend. The final shot makes sure it is not. Homer sits down in the pew, and within about 3 minutes he is unconscious. Head back, mouth open, out cold, in the middle of the service, in the same building he nearly burned his house down to avoid. Nothing changed. He lost his home, was rescued by 3 neighbors from 3 religions, got a personal explanation from a minister and a private conversation with God, and he still cannot stay awake through a sermon. The writers had every opportunity to end this one clean. The sinner comes back. The sinner is sorry. The family is whole. That version of the ending was sitting right there, and they refused it. What they aired instead says the church can survive Homer Simpson, but it cannot hold his attention for a full hour, and no amount of divine intervention is going to fix that. That ending set the pattern. For 3 decades, this family kept attending, kept praying, kept believing, and kept failing to be changed by any of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer's fight with the church was loud. The man standing at the front of it was a quieter problem, and it took the writers 5 more years to explain what had happened to him. Section 11. The Man in the Pulpit. Reverend Timothy Lovejoy turns up on February 25, 1990, in an episode called The Telltale Head. Harry Shearer voices him, and has ever since. He is the longest-running fictional clergyman in American television history. He has been standing at the front of that church for 35 years, which means that for an enormous number of people around the world, he is the only Protestant minister they have ever spent real time with. Hold on to that through this whole section. Whatever the writers decided he would be, that decision traveled further than any actual sermon ever preached. And what they decided was that he would be tired. Not evil, not a fraud with a mansion and a private jet, which is the easy version and the one comedy usually reaches for. Just a man who has been doing a job for a long time and has stopped believing it accomplishes anything. Nobody outside the show ever had to be convinced this character was unfair. He never does anything monstrous, and that is the problem, because a monster can be waved off as a cartoon. A bored one cannot. Coming up, what the writers were actually going for with him. Section 12. A real person who happens to be a minister. Reverend Timothy Lovejoy first appeared in 1990, and the writers who built him were aiming for respect. Al Jean has said, in comments quoted in Mark Pinsky's book on religion in the series, that Sam Simon wanted Lovejoy built as a realistic person who happened to work as a minister, not the hypocritical cartoon preacher. A human being with a job. That sounds like a defense, and in a way it is. The show avoided the cheap route on purpose, except look at where realism landed them. The realistic version of a small-town minister, as imagined by a room full of comedy writers in Los Angeles, is a man worn down to nothing by the people who need him most. That hit hit harder than a fraud would have. A crooked preacher is somebody else's church. A burned out one is recognizable, and recognizable is what makes an audience uncomfortable. Working clergy who watched the show tended not to complain about the jokes. They complained about how familiar he felt, which is a much worse review. Next, the morning the congregation stopped listening. Section 13. The congregation walks out. April 27, 1997. In Marge We Trust, written by Donick Cary, directed by Stephen Dean Moore. It opens on a sermon, and it opens on people leaving, not storming out, just drifting, checking watches, losing interest halfway through. Marge notices what everybody else in the room has already accepted, which is that nobody is listening to this man anymore. She volunteers to help out around the church. She ends up in a small office taking phone calls from people in trouble, and they start asking for her by name. They call her the Listen Lady. She has no training, no ordination, no seminary, no credentials of any kind. She is a housewife in a small room with a telephone, and she is better at the central task of the job than the man who studied for it. The episode is warm about her. That is what makes it cruel about him. Nobody in the story is trying to humiliate Lovejoy. The congregation simply found somebody who pays attention and went there instead. Then come the phone calls that did the damage. Section 14. The phone calls. The flashback inside In Marge We Trust from April 1997 changed Reverend Lovejoy permanently. Lovejoy was not always like this. When he first arrived in Springfield, he was warm, eager, genuinely delighted to be helping people. The animation gives him a different posture, upright and bright-eyed, like a man who cannot wait to get started. Then Ned Flanders starts calling. Ned calls constantly. About nothing. About problems that are not problems. In the call the episode chooses to show, Ned confesses that he has been coveting his own wife, which is not a sin, and asks what he ought to do about it. Lovejoy sits at his desk with the phone against his ear, and the light goes out of him in real time. The animation does most of the work in that sequence. His posture drops. His face slackens. The show ages a man through a series of identical phone calls without a single line of dialogue explaining what is happening to him, and it is one of the few well-made pieces of character work in the series. That is the show's explanation for why the minister stopped caring. No scandal, no money trouble, no crisis of belief. One sincere parishioner phoned too often, and the show is clear that this was enough. Ahead, the flat little line at the center of the character. Section 15. He just stopped caring. The most important line Reverend Lovejoy ever speaks arrives in Marge We Trust, and it is delivered completely flat. Somewhere in the middle of all those phone calls, Lovejoy explains he simply stopped caring. No crisis, no moment. He just quietly gave up on the part of the job that involved other people's problems, and nobody noticed because he kept showing up and doing the service. Nothing else the show has said about organizations is this honest, and it is why this episode gets cited more than any other. A man can keep the title, keep the building, keep the schedule, and be gone. The congregation did not lose a minister. They lost his attention years ago, and the machine kept running, because a church can run on habit for a long time. Plenty of people have drifted out of a job while still doing it, and they recognize this instantly. So did a fair number whose job was ministry. Nobody in the story treats it as a tragedy. The congregation carries on. The building stays open. Lovejoy keeps preaching. A church can lose the thing at its center and keep running for decades without anybody noticing, because the schedule is the part people actually attend. Where he goes, instead of doing the job, next. Section 16. The trains in the basement. Reverend Lovejoy has a hobby, and in Marge We Trust reveals what he does with the hours he no longer spends on his congregation. He goes downstairs and plays with model trains. He has a full setup down there, tracks and engines and little painted scenery, and he disappears into it. When Marge comes looking for him with an actual emergency, he is in the middle of running a locomotive around a loop, and he does not want to be interrupted. A minister, hiding in a basement from the people upstairs who need him, is not a joke that improves with thinking about it. The show does not linger. It plays the scene quickly, gets its laugh from the tiny trains, and moves on. But the image stays, and it is the single most repeated visual in every argument about this character. The choice of hobby is almost sad. Model railways are about control. Everything runs on time, nothing surprises anybody, and nobody rings at home about coveting their own wife. and the trains are the only thing in his life that he is shown enjoying. Not the sermons, not the congregation, not his wife or his daughter. A grown man's entire remaining pleasure fits on a table in a cellar, and the one time somebody upstairs genuinely needs him, he resents the interruption. Up next, what he tells Marge about the Bible. Section 17. Have you ever read this thing? Reverend Lovejoy's opinion of the Bible comes up repeatedly across the 1990s. Marge brings him a real problem and points out that the book must have something to say about it. His answer is that the Bible does not actually cover everything. Then he asks her whether she has ever genuinely sat down and read the thing. So a minister, standing in a church, tells a member of his congregation that the book is not much help and probably not worth finishing. He does this more than once across the series. On another occasion, asked what counts as a sin, he waves it away by saying that basically everything is. Not as a theological point, as a way of ending the conversation so he can get on with his day. The man whose entire profession is built on one book treats that book like paperwork. For viewers who take scripture seriously, this is worse than mockery. Mockery at least takes the thing seriously enough to aim at it. This is a shrug, and it is aimed at a real habit. Plenty of people who attend church every week have never read the book the whole thing is built on, and the show is pointing out that the man at the front might not have either. A joke about clergy and about the pews at the same time. Coming up, the advice he gives the most faithful man in town. Section 18. Try one of the other religions. In Hurricane Nettie, from December 1996, Ned Flanders loses his faith and goes to his minister for help. He is the most devoted member of that congregation. He calls constantly, he gives generously, and he takes every word from the pulpit seriously. When he finally arrives in real spiritual pain, having lost his faith after a disaster tore his life apart, he goes to his minister for help. Lovejoy tells him to have a look at one of the other major religions. As far as he can tell, they are all pretty much the same. A Christian pastor is telling a grieving Christian to shop elsewhere. The line is funny because of how fast it is. No build-up, no cruelty in the delivery. Harshness is not what this is. He genuinely does not have anything better to offer and does not seem troubled about it. Walk into a church office after losing somebody, hoping to be met, and that scene is describing exactly what happens. The show got a laugh out of the worst thing that can happen in that room. The line also quietly says something about what Lovejoy believes. A minister who genuinely thought his own church held the truth could not send a grieving man elsewhere. He is not being cruel. He has simply stopped believing his product is different from anybody else's, and he sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Then there is what he says over a dying man. Section 19. Might as well do a voodoo dance. The coldest line in 35 years of this show belongs to a deathbed scene. Grandpa Simpson appears to be dying, and Marge asks Reverend Lovejoy to perform last rites. He tells her he might as well do a voodoo dance because the words do not actually do anything. Nothing else in his whole run comes close to this. Here is the one moment where a minister's job genuinely matters, where the ritual exists purely to give a frightened family something to hold on to, and he announces to their faces that he thinks it is meaningless. Being tired is fair enough, and the show spent years earning it for him. But the family is standing right there, waiting, and he says it anyway. Comedy usually protects itself here by making the character a villain, so the audience knows the show disagrees with him. The Simpsons does not do that. Lovejoy stays the reasonable one in most scenes, which means the show never quite says he is wrong about the words. That refusal to mark him as the bad guy is the whole reason this material stuck. A villain can be waved away. A tired professional saying the quiet part out loud in front of a frightened family is something a lot of viewers have witnessed for real, and the show knows it. Still ahead, the name he calls an 8-year-old girl. Section 20. Devil daughter Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. In the season 13 episode She of Little Faith, she leaves the church after it gets covered in advertising, and she starts reading about Buddhism. Lovejoy's response is to call her the devil daughter of Marge Simpson. A grown man who runs a church looks at a child in his own congregation, one of the most thoughtful people in the entire town, and labels her a servant of the devil because she picked up a book. The line goes by fast, and the episode moves on to other things. It has been quoted ever since by people arguing that this show holds clergy in contempt, and it is genuinely hard to build a defense for it. She has not renounced God either. She says so out loud more than once. She still believes and is looking for another way toward the same thing. Instead of asking, he picks a label and uses it on a child. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Reverend at least got an explanation for why he turned out that way. His own household never got that courtesy, and what one of them did inside that church is the ugliest thing anybody in Springfield has done to a collection plate. Section 21. The pastor's wife, Helen Lovejoy, the minister's wife, has been the town gossip of Springfield since the early 1990s. A secret monster would be easier to dismiss, and the writers did not give her that. She is written as a woman who honestly believes she is helping while she spreads a rumor that will hurt somebody, and who has never once considered that those two things might be connected. Her signature move is to shut down any conversation she is losing by begging the room to think of the children. She does it constantly. It works nearly every time because nobody in Springfield has ever figured out how to argue with it. That phrase escaped the show completely. People all over the world now use it without having watched a full episode, aimed at exactly the kind of panic Helen was invented to mock. A cartoon minister's wife handed the English language its shorthand for moral hysteria. Put her next to her husband, and the picture gets specific. He has stopped caring about the congregation. She cares intensely, in the worst available way, about what everybody in it is doing wrong. Between the two of them, the family running the First Church of Springfield spends more energy on other people's business than on anything happening in the sanctuary, and they have not even got to the daughter yet. Next, what the Reverend's daughter does during a service. Section 22. The Preacher's Kid Robs the Church, November 6, 1994. Bart's Girlfriend, written by Jonathan Collier, directed by Susie Dieter, with Meryl Streep guest starring. Bart falls for Jessica Lovejoy, the Reverend's daughter, home from boarding school. In front of adults, she is flawless, polite, soft-spoken, reads scripture beautifully from the front of the church. In private, she is a liar and a thief who enjoys wrecking things, and she is far worse at it than Bart has ever been, which is the joke that powers the whole episode. Then she goes too far. During a service, with the plate going around, she empties the collection money into her purse. That is cash the congregation handed over minutes earlier. In her father's church, during his sermon. Then she drops the empty plate into Bart's lap and walks out. Nobody does anything colder to a church across the whole run of this show, and the minister's own child does it, using the fact that nobody would ever suspect her as the tool that makes it work. She understood her father's reputation well enough to weaponize it, and then somebody has to get blamed for it. Section 23. Nobody believes the kid. The accusation in Bart's Girlfriend does not come from Reverend Lovejoy. His wife Helen spots the empty collection plate in Bart's lap and says something. The accusation moves through the congregation in about 4 seconds and lands on Bart, because Bart is the obvious answer. He is a troublemaker sitting next to a preacher's daughter with an empty plate in his lap. Nobody asks a single question. Homer assumes his own son is guilty. Only Marge holds out. Lisa eventually forces the issue in front of the whole congregation, and the money turns up hidden under Jessica's mattress. And here is where the episode stops being a comedy about a bad girlfriend. Standing in front of the evidence, in front of everybody, Reverend Lovejoy refuses to accept it. He insists Bart must have put it there. His daughter's guilt is sitting in a pile on the floor, and he is still arguing about the boy. Only Jessica admitting it herself stops him. This is a man who would rather let somebody else's child take the blame than adjust his picture of his own, and the show does not soften it or apologize for it. Coming up, the reason she gives when she finally admits it. Section 24. She did it to get his attention. The confession at the end of Bart's Girlfriend from November 1994 comes with a reason attached. She did it to get her father's attention. That single line reframes the whole episode and quietly ties it back to everything the show has been building about this man. He stopped caring about his congregation years ago. He hides in the basement from the people upstairs. He tells the grieving to try another religion. His daughter grew up inside that, and she worked out that the only reliable way to make him look at her was to steal from his church during his own service. The episode does not play it for a laugh. The episode does not play it as one. It lands, sits there for a beat, and then the story wraps up with Jessica scrubbing the church steps as punishment while her father stands nearby, having learned nothing. For a comedy that gets accused of hating clergy, this is the most damning thing it ever put on screen about one, and it does it without a single cheap shot. It just shows a man whose child had to commit a crime to be noticed. Up next, the lawsuit that hands Homer the deed to a church. Section 25. Homer sues the church and wins. February 9, 2003. Pray Anything. Written by Sam O'Neill and Neil Bushell, directed by Mike B. Polcino. Homer trips in a pothole on church property and injures himself. He sues. He wins. The court awards him the church building itself because the congregation has no money to pay damages, and the deed goes to Homer Simpson. He moves in. He turns the sanctuary into a party house. People are drinking in the pews. Somebody installs a slide. The congregation, meanwhile, has nowhere to go and holds services outside in the mud. The premise alone is enough to make the point. A man with no faith takes legal ownership of a house of worship because of a hole in the ground, and the law is entirely on his side. Nothing about it is supernatural. He did not trick anybody. He filed a claim, and the system handed him a church. Eventually, God floods the town to end it. The show returns to its usual position that God is real and does intervene, right after 20 minutes arguing that a church is a piece of property like any other. One scene in that episode had Fox fighting back. That is next. Section 26. The scene Fox fought over. One detail about that episode only came out later, on the DVD commentary. Al Jean has said the staff got into a fight with the Broadcast Standards Department over a scene of Homer dancing around inside the church in his underwear. Standards and practices exists at every network. Its job is to sit between the writers and the audience and take things out. They pushed back on that scene and nothing else, which marks where Fox actually drew its line in 2003. Homer suing a congregation into homelessness was fine. A flood sent by God as a plot device was fine. Turning a sanctuary into a nightclub was fine. A man dancing in his underwear inside the building was the problem. That is not a religious objection. This is a taste objection, and it exposes something about how these decisions get made. The network was not weighing whether the episode insulted anybody's faith. It was weighing how one image would look to a certain kind of complaint, and everything else went through. Still ahead, what happens when somebody else takes the pulpit? Section 27. The Replacement Preacher. The show has tried more than once to imagine that church with somebody else at the front of it. In the season 24 episode Pulpit Friction, from 2013, a new reverend arrives in Springfield. He is younger, funnier, and much better at the job. The congregation takes to him immediately, and Lovejoy gets shoved aside in his own building. That storyline did something the writers almost certainly did not plan for. Real ministers started using it in sermons because it describes a thing that genuinely happens and that nobody in the profession talks about much, which is watching your own congregation drift towards somebody more entertaining. The show keeps returning to this idea because it is the only real threat Lovejoy faces. Nobody in Springfield is going to run him out for being cynical. They will absolutely leave him for somebody with a guitar. And the next time the writers tried it, they built a two-part story around it, gave the new preacher a genuine personality and a real philosophy, and got the worst ratings in the history of the show. Then comes the two-part story that set a record nobody wanted. Section 28, the lowest rated episode ever made. April 26th and May 3rd, 2020. Warren Priests, Parts 1 and 2. Written by the comedian Pete Holmes, who also voices the guest character. Part 1 directed by Bob Anderson. Part 2 by Matthew Nastuk. A young preacher named Bodie Wright arrives in Springfield. He plays guitar. His sermons are inclusive and warm, and people actually listen to them. Attendance climbs. The church feels alive for the first time in decades. Lovejoy's response is to investigate him. He digs into the man's past looking for something usable because he wants his pulpit back. Part 1 of that story became the lowest rated episode in the entire history of The Simpsons. Think about what that means. The show put a kind, competent, likable minister on screen, gave him 2 full episodes, and the audience did not want him. They wanted the burned out one who hides in the basement. Be fair about that result. Ratings in 2020 were shaped by a lot of things that had nothing to do with the story, and one episode is not a referendum. But the writers had spent 3 decades teaching an audience what a minister looks like on this show, and when they offered a different one, nobody turned up to see it. 30 years of writing had trained several generations of viewers to expect a specific kind of clergyman, and when the show finally offered a better one, nobody came. Coming up, the sponsor who pays to rebuild the church. Section 29. The church sells its walls in She of Little Faith. A model rocket built by Bart and Homer crashes straight into the First Church of Springfield and destroys the building. The congregation cannot afford to rebuild, so Mr. Burns steps in with the money. What he puts up is a church covered in advertising, sponsor names on the pulpit, commercials running during the service. The whole sanctuary rebuilt as a delivery system for brands, with the worship fitted in around the ad breaks. jokes. Nobody is laughing at the congregation here. They had no other option. The target is what happens when a church runs out of money and somebody with money notices. Lovejoy goes along with it. The detail matters. No resistance, no objection, no sense that a line has been crossed. The building is standing and the bills are paid. It takes an 8-year-old girl to look around at what her church has become and decide she cannot sit in it anymore, which is what sets the entire rest of that episode in motion. Next, the small jokes about money that nobody ever complained about. Section 30, the plate comes round twice. Across 35 years, underneath the big storylines, this show has run a steady drip of small gags about church money. The collection plate goes round more than once in the same service. Lovejoy is repeatedly shown counting cash. Fundraising drives turn into schemes. The building is perpetually broke and perpetually asking. Then there is the sign out front, which changes almost every episode. That sign has been running as a visual joke almost as long as the show, and the messages on it are usually the church trying to sell itself to a town that would rather be doing something else. It advertises. It guilts. It bargains. None are big moments. No religious organization ever issued a statement about a church sign gag. They matter because of volume. Over 35 years, across hundreds of episodes, they build a background impression that the First Church of Springfield is, before anything else, a business with a cash flow problem. That impression works on the audience harder than any single controversial episode ever did, because nobody notices it happening. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So much for the church and the family running it. One more person in Springfield has his whole life organized around that building, and a magazine founded by Billy Graham once called him the most recognizable Christian in America. Section 31. Christianity Today puts him on the cover, February 5, 2001. Christianity Today, the magazine founded by Billy Graham, runs Ned Flanders on the front. Not as a joke, he is painted as a religious icon in the old Byzantine style, holding a jeweled book in one hand, with Homer and Marge floating behind him as angels. The headline calls him Saint Flanders. The story inside was written by a religion reporter named Mark Pinsky, and his argument was blunt. On American campuses, he wrote, the name most closely tied to the word Christian, apart from Jesus, was not the Pope, not Mother Teresa either, and not Billy Graham. A cartoon neighbor with a mustache and a green sweater held that spot. A magazine founded by Billy Graham printed that about Billy Graham in Billy Graham's own publication and treated it as a fact its readers needed to deal with rather than an insult to argue with. Pinsky was not a Christian writing about his own faith either. He describes himself as an observant Jew. The most sympathetic book ever written about Christianity on The Simpsons was written by a Jewish reporter who watched the show with his kids. Here is the strangest thing about Ned Flanders. The people best positioned to be offended by him mostly claimed him instead. Ahead, the picture the studio refused to hand over. Section 32. Fox would not hand over. The pictures, one small detail attached to that cover story, says more about the relationship than the article does. Fox refused to give Christianity Today any images of the characters. A Christian magazine was writing a warm, serious, largely admiring cover story about religion on The Simpsons, and the studio that owns the show would not supply a single picture for the print issue. They had to put it together without the studio's help. Nobody has ever fully explained that decision. It may have been ordinary licensing caution, since Fox has always guarded these characters aggressively and has gone after fan sites over far less. The timing makes it stranger. This was early 2001, roughly 2 years after the Catholic League campaign, with the standing instruction about naming religions still fresh. A studio that had just been burned by one religious organization was being handed a friendly write-up by another, and it kept its distance from both. But look at the shape of it. The show spends decades being accused of hostility toward religion. A major religious publication decides to defend it in print, and the response from the studio is to lock the door. Whatever was going on inside Fox in early 2001, being embraced by evangelical Christians, was apparently not something the legal department wanted to help along. The article ran anyway, without the artwork, and it is still the piece everybody cites. Up next, the voice that escaped the show completely. Section 33. Oakley Dokley Ned Flanders has talked the same way since the series premiere in December 1989, and the writers built that voice out of nonsense syllables. Ordinary words get stretched and doubled until they come out as Oakley Dokley and Hi Diddly Ho. He says gosh and darn where other characters swear. He apologizes constantly, sometimes for things that happen to him. He is physically incapable of finishing an insult, and on the rare occasions he tries, it collapses halfway through. That speech pattern escaped the show almost immediately and became national shorthand. People who have never watched an episode use it now, aimed at a specific kind of Christian, the type considered too polite to be direct and too cheerful to be taken seriously. It shows up in workplaces and comment sections and conversations about people who have never heard of Springfield. Whether that counts as affection or mockery depends entirely on who is doing the impression and why. The writers were laughing with him most of the time. 35 years later, an enormous number of people using his voice are not, and the character has no control over which version travels. Then there is how the Flanders boys are actually raised. Section 34. How Rod and Todd are raised. Todd Flanders turned up in the very first episode in December 1989, and Rod arrived a season later. Neither of them is allowed most of what other children have. Their toys are restricted. Their board games are built around Bible stories. Their television is filtered down to almost nothing. When Ned takes something away, and he does it often, the boys accept it immediately because nobody has ever suggested to them that their lives could be arranged differently. The show frames this as sad rather than funny, and that framing is the part that generated letters. Nobody is laughing at the Flanders boys for being weird. They are being quietly damaged, and that their father cannot see it because he is doing what he believes he is supposed to do. The show is making a real argument here, on network television for 3 decades, that raising children inside a strict religious household costs them something. The show has never walked it back and has never softened it. They are also the only children in Springfield who never seem to have any fun. Bart is a menace, and Lisa is lonely, but both are recognizably kids. The Flanders boys move through every scene like small adults waiting for permission. Plenty of viewers agreed. Plenty of others were watching with their own children, in their own strict religious households, and understood what was being said about them. Coming up, the storm that hits one house on the street and no others. Section 35. Only His House. December 29th, 1996. Hurricane Nettie. Written by Steve Young. Directed by Bob Anderson. A hurricane hits Springfield. When it clears, every house on the street is standing, except one. Ned Flanders, the most faithful man in town, loses everything. His neighbors, including a man who invented his own religion 2 seasons earlier, specifically to avoid going to church, lose nothing at all. The episode does not hide what it is doing. This is the Book of Job restaged in a cul-de-sac, and Ned says the quiet part out loud, standing in the wreckage of his home, asking what he could possibly have done to deserve this. The oldest question in religion, and the show puts it in the mouth of a man in a green sweater holding a broken picture frame. The town rebuilds his house out of pity. They do it badly. It collapses. So the story is not simply that God took everything from the most devout man on the street. The story is that when his community tried to help, they made it worse, and he had to stand there and thank them for it. Next, the explanation the writers gave for why he turned out this way. Section 36. The Spankological Protocol. The breakdown at the center of Hurricane Nettie is the only time in 35 years that Ned Flanders says what he actually thinks. He screams at his neighbors. He tells every one of them what he actually thinks of them, which after years of swallowing everything comes out as a flood. Then he checks himself into a mental hospital, and the show explains him. His parents were beatniks who refused to discipline him at all. A doctor put him through something the episode calls the University of Minnesota Spankological Protocol, 8 straight months of spanking, which left him permanently unable to express anger. So the origin story for the most famous Christian character on television is 8 months of corporal punishment. The show's official position is that Ned's faith is a lid bolted onto rage, installed by childhood damage, and that his politeness is not virtue, but a malfunction. His kindness is real, but the machinery underneath it is broken, and it broke before he ever picked up a Bible. As theories about why people become devout go, this one is cold. The series has never taken it back, and it sits underneath every gentle Flanders moment that came afterward, and it explains the voice, the apologizing, the doubled syllables, the inability to finish an insult. All of it stops being a quirk and becomes a symptom. Still ahead, how the show killed his wife. Section 37. The Shirt Cannon. February 13th, 2000. Alone Again, Natura Diddley. Written by Ian Maxtone Graham. Directed by Jim Reardon. Maud Flanders is at a racetrack with her family. A promotional cannon fires a volley of t-shirts into the crowd. She is standing when it happens, gets hit, and goes over a railing to her death. She is standing because Homer got up to buy a hot dog at exactly the wrong moment, it, which pulled her into the line of fire. The show killed the wife of its only genuinely devout character in a stupid accident caused by the appetite of its least devout one. Very few unambiguously religious adult women existed anywhere on American network television, and she was one. She prayed, she meant it, she was not a punchline, and Fox wrote her out with a shirt cannon. The episode itself is more careful than that description suggests. It takes Ned's grief seriously and gives him real anger at God. But the way she dies, how cheap it is what people reacted to, because it looked like the show going out of its way to be flippant about the one character it usually protected. Then he builds something in her memory. Section 38. The miracles were a gas leak. May 6, 2001. I'm Going to Praiseland, written by Julie Thacker, directed by Chuck Sheets. Ned finds Maud's old sketchbook after she dies. The book is full of drawings of a Christian amusement park she had imagined and never built, so he builds it for her, in her memory, and opens it to the public. Nobody comes. A religious theme park with no rides is not a day out. Then visitors start seeing heaven, real visions, described in detail in the middle of the park. Word spreads that Praiseland is producing genuine miracles, and the crowds arrive. The visions are caused by a gas leak. That same move shows up again and again, and once it is visible, it is impossible to miss. A miracle happens in public, people believe it, and then the cause turns out to be a broken pipe, a marketing budget, a prosthetic limb, or a coincidence. The show almost never lets a public miracle stand. What makes this one land harder than most is that the man selling it was not lying. Ned believed it too, and he built the whole thing out of grief. Coming up, the episode title that borrowed words from the cross. Section 39, Why Hast Thou Forsaken Me? In 2019, the show ran an episode called Todd, Why Hast Thou Forsaken Me? That title is a direct lift from the words spoken from the cross in the Gospels, the single most sacred moment in the Christian story, applied here to a cartoon boy. Inside the episode, Todd Flanders loses his faith. He is still grieving his mother years later, and he decides he does not believe anymore. Ned cannot handle it at all. So Todd ends up living with the Simpsons, which means Homer Simpson, of all people, is now responsible for a Christian child who has stopped believing in God. The episode itself is gentler than it sounds. Homer does a reasonable job. The story treats Todd's doubt as real rather than as a phase to be corrected. The title is what drew complaints, and it is hard to argue those complaints were unreasonable. The show reached for the words of the crucifixion to make a joke about a side character's dead mother, and it put them in the episode title where nobody could miss them. Up next, The Second Wife and How She Was Written Out. Section 40. Widowed Twice. Years after Maud, the writers gave Ned a second marriage. They paired him with Edna Krabappel, Bart's schoolteacher, a woman who smoked, drank, and had no patience whatsoever for his rules. On paper, it should not have worked. It became one of the show's more interesting relationships, mostly because neither of them changed to accommodate the other. Then Marcia Wallace, who had voiced Edna for more than 2 decades, died in 2013. The show retired the character rather than recast her, and Ned was widowed a second time. So the most devout man in Springfield has now buried 2 wives. The first was killed by a t-shirt cannon because Homer wanted a hot dog. The second was written out because a performer in the real world passed away, and the producers decided nobody else should speak her lines. Both times, the show had him grieve on screen. Both times, he went back to being the neighbor everybody borrows things from and nobody thinks about. Whatever the writers intended, the record is the record. The more seriously a character here takes their faith, the more the show takes from them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything so far came from inside the writer's room, and nobody outside it had changed a single frame. That ended at the close of the 90s, when one organization started counting specific jokes and took the tally to the network. Section 41. The organization that counted the jokes. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights is an American organization that watches how Catholics get portrayed in entertainment and news. For decades, it has been run by a man named Bill Donahue. The method is simple and it is effective. They watch. They write down specific lines from specific broadcasts with dates. They name the network. They name the advertisers. Then they issue a public statement and tell their members about it. They do not sue very often. They do not need to. Networks will change a line rather than spend a month answering questions about why they refuse to. One thing before any of this starts, because nearly every version of this story leaves it out. Donahue has said in his own public statements that he is not against The Simpsons. He has said the average viewer will find a great deal to praise about it, and that the Catholic League usually agrees. His complaint was narrow. 2 episodes in 1999 crossed a line, in his view, and one Halloween episode years later did the same. The man most often described as this show's leading religious enemy has repeatedly said he likes it, which makes what happened next stranger rather than simpler. Next, the line in a moving car that started all of it. Section 42. Communion wafers and booze. The Simpsons are driving home from a church service, and Bart is hungry. He asks his mother whether the family can go Catholic, because if they do, they will get communion wafers and booze. For a Catholic viewer, that line does something specific. Catholic teaching does not treat the Eucharist as a snack. It sits at the center of the whole faith, and the belief is that it genuinely becomes the body and blood of Christ during the Mass. Bart's line collapses all of that into free food and a drink he is not old enough to have. The joke works on its own terms. A hungry 10-year-old is thinking about lunch, and the writers can argue with a straight face that they were mocking Bart rather than the sacrament, because that is what the scene shows. The Catholic League did not read it that way. They objected in writing, quoting the line back with the episode attached, and asked the network to account for it, and that would have been the end of it, the way it was every other time, if the show had stopped there. Marge answers him, and her half is the one people forget. Section 43. 3 children is enough. The second half of that 1998 exchange belongs to Marge, and it is the half that gets forgotten. She says nobody is going Catholic, and she adds that 3 children is enough. Thank you. That reply is the sharper half of the exchange, and it is the half that gets forgotten. Bart's line is about snacks. Marge's line is about birth control, and it is aimed directly at Catholic teaching on contraception and family size, delivered as a throwaway. So the joke is not one joke. 2 jokes, stacked, inside about 9 seconds of screen time. The first reduces the central sacrament to catering. The second uses a stereotype about large Catholic families as a punchline and moves on before anybody can react. For an organization whose entire job is cataloging exactly this, the exchange was not ambiguous. The useful part is how ordinary it is. This is not a special episode about religion. No debate, no theme, no argument being made. A family is sitting in a car, and the writers dropped 2 shots at a specific church into a scene about nothing at all. The League was objecting to that texture, not one episode. The background hum. Coming up, the letter Fox wrote back. Section 44. Fox writes back. The network answered, and it did not apologize. According to reporting by John Dart, published in the Christian Century on January 31, 2001, a Fox broadcast standards manager named Thomas Chavez wrote back to the Catholic League defending the line. His argument was that Bart, like plenty of children who do not understand what they are looking at, sees the wafer as food and the wine as a drink he is too young for. The target, in other words, is a child's ignorance rather than the sacrament. On Marge, Chavez conceded that her reply came across as short, but he said she was stating a fact about her own family, which is a defense that works better on paper than it does when the line is read out loud. Nothing was cut, nothing was changed. The episode continued to air exactly as written. That refusal is the most important thing in this whole section, and it is easy to skip past. It proves Fox was perfectly willing to hold its ground on a religious complaint when it wanted to, which means when the network did move, about a year later, it moved because something had changed. Not the principle, the pressure. Still ahead, the joke that went out after the Super Bowl. Section 45, the Super Bowl commercial, January 31st, 1999. The episode airing straight after the Super Bowl. That slot is the most valuable half hour on American television. The audience is not the show's usual audience. Enormous, and packed with people who never watched The Simpsons and only stayed on the channel because the game finished. Into that slot, the writers dropped a short gag built to look like a commercial. A nerdy driver pulls into a gas station and honks for service. 3 women in almost nothing come out and turn washing his windscreen and filling his tank into something the show plays as openly sexual. Then one of them leans down, a large cross swings out from her neck, and a voice announces that the Catholic Church has made a few changes. The bit is a parody of Super Bowl advertising, the writer's actual target. Every ad in that broadcast was selling something with the same tools. None of that mattered once it aired. What millions of people who had never seen a religious joke on this show saw was the name of their church attached to that footage, in front of the largest audience of the year. Then the Fox mailroom starts filling up. Section 46. The mailroom fills up. The Catholic League moved immediately, and this time they did not simply issue a statement. They organized. They told their their members what had happened, and their members wrote to Fox. Fox was buried, not in press releases from an office in New York, which any network can ignore, but in letters from ordinary viewers arriving in volume over a sustained period. That difference is the whole thing, and it explains why almost every other religious complaint in this video went nowhere. A television network is not especially moved by an organization's opinion. Opinions are free and everybody has one. What moves a network is a number it can put in front of an executive, and a full mailroom is a number. It can be counted, reported upward, and turned into a slide. The league understood that better than anyone else who ever objected to this show. They were not trying to win an argument about theology. They were creating an administrative problem, and they knew that a network will always solve an administrative problem faster than a moral one. It worked, and it is the only time it ever did. Up next, the instruction the network handed the writers. Section 47. Lay off Catholics. What Fox did in 1999, after the mail arrived, is the hardest piece of evidence in this entire video. According to the Los Angeles Times critic Howard Rosenberg, whose reporting was cited in that same Christian Century piece, Fox responded to the flood of letters by instructing the writers of The Simpsons to lay off Catholics, not to ease up on religion, not to be more careful with jokes about faith generally, to stop attributing offensive lines to one specific church. A religious organization reached into the writer's room of the most watched cartoon on Earth and changed the instructions the staff were working under. Nobody else covered in this video managed anything close to that. And notice what the instruction is actually protecting. It is not protecting the sacrament, or the congregation, or anyone's belief. It is protecting Fox from a repeat of the mail. The network did not decide the joke had been unfair. Nothing suggests anybody at Fox sat down and asked whether the league had a point. The question being answered was how much correspondence the company was prepared to process, and the answer turned out to be less than it had just received. Coming up, the answer Mike Scully got when he pushed back. Section 48. Methodists, Presbyterians, or Baptists. Mike Scully was running The Simpsons in 1999 when the instruction about Catholics came down, and he complained bitterly about it. By his own account, it came down from Roland McFarland, a Fox vice president on the broadcast standards side, and the answer Scully got is the part that should stop anybody who thinks this was a story about respect. He was told the show could still aim exactly the same jokes at Methodists, Presbyterians, or Baptists. Those were fine. Read that again. The network was not saying religious mockery was a problem. One denomination had an organization capable of generating enough mail to become a headache, and the others did not. So the rule handed to the writers was not about faith at all. The rule was a map of which religious groups could fight back. That is also why the show's invented denomination has been so useful. The Simpsons belong to the Western branch of American Reformed Presbylutheranism, a name stitched together from Presbyterian and Lutheran. It sounds like a real church. No such church exists, so nobody can complain on its behalf. Next, what quietly changed when the episode was repeated. Section 49. The rerun edit. The Super Bowl episode came back around as a rerun in May 1999, and something in it had changed. The words Catholic Church were gone. The line now referred to the church. Same joke, same footage, same gas station, same women, same cross. One proper noun swapped for a generic one, and with it any way of tracing the punchline back to an organization with a mailing list. Most people watching that rerun would never have noticed. No announcement, no disclaimer, and the show has never made anything of it. Almost nothing else in 35 years shows The Simpsons changing religious material after broadcast because somebody outside complained, and it is worth being precise about how small it is. Nothing was cut. Nobody apologized. The show did not stop making jokes about churches, priests, communion, heaven, or God, and the rate of those jokes did not drop afterward. What changed was the label, and that is the entire prize. 35 years of complaints from every direction, and the total measurable result is one edited phrase in one rerun, plus a standing note to the writers about which names to avoid. Say that plainly, because it cuts against how this story usually gets told. Fox did not censor The Simpsons. The show was never reined in, never softened, and never lost a religious storyline to network pressure. One noun changed in one repeat, and that is the high watermark of every campaign campaign in this video. Then the same fight happens again, 11 years later. Section 50, the Halloween rematch. 11 years later, in a Treehouse of Horror segment that aired in 2010, Marge makes a comment about what kind of civilized people would eat the body and blood of their savior. That is the Eucharist, described from the outside, the way somebody would describe it if they had just heard about it for the first time and were repeating it back in disbelief. Donahue's response was to ask what kind of civilized people work at Fox. The exchange was covered in Catholic press, and it went no further than that. No mail campaign this time, no instruction to the writers, no edit, which tells you the 1999 result was not a permanent shift in the balance of power. The league caught a moment. The league caught the network in a specific week with a specific broadcast in front of a specific audience and got a specific concession. By 2010, the show was airing the same kind of joke about the same sacrament, and the strongest available response was a quotable line in a press release. Nothing had been won and nothing had been lost. Both sides were where they started, arguing about the same 12 seconds of television. The league had also lost what made 1999 work. No Super Bowl slot, no wave of first-time viewers, no mailroom filling up. Without those, it was just an opinion, and networks get opinions all day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The league's whole campaign was about a handful of quick jokes. 6 years later, the show sent Bart Simpson to a Catholic school and let him convert. In an episode, Fox pulled off the schedule because of what happened in Rome. Section 51, Bart gets sent to Catholic school, May 15, 2005. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Guest Star. Written by Matt Warburton, directed by Michael Polcino, 21st episode of season 16. Bart destroys a medieval fair at his school so thoroughly that Springfield Elementary throws him out for good. The only place in town that will take him is the local Catholic school. Homer drops him off expecting nothing. He assumes his son will be back out on the street within a week. What Bart finds there is the opposite: structure, discipline, adults who take his behavior seriously instead of treating him as a lost cause and waiting for him to leave. For the first time in the whole run, Bart Simpson is somewhere that is good for him, and that place is a religious school. Hold that against the show's reputation for a second. This is the show accused for decades of hating the church, and the setup of this episode is that the church succeeded with a child where the secular school system had already given up. Everything that goes wrong later goes wrong because the adults around him panic. Nothing goes wrong because of the school. This show does not usually hand a church anything like that, and it is handed over without a single undercutting joke. The Catholic school is competent. The staff are patient. Bart, who has defeated every adult who ever tried to manage him, is being reached, and the episode plays it straight. Ahead, the priest they built to run that school. Section 52, the priest who is not a punchline. The Catholic priest in the 2005 episode The Father, the Son, and the Holy Guest Star is called Father Sean, and Liam Neeson voices him. Not a fraud, not a creep, not a fool. Those are the three options television usually picks from when a Catholic priest walks into a scene, and the writers used none of them. He is a former troublemaker himself, tough and warm, genuinely interested in the kid in front of him. He talks to Bart about the fights he got into as a young man, and about what turned him around. There is no lecture and no moralizing. He is one of the most sympathetic religious figures the show has ever created, and he is the one who leads a child away from his family's faith. The casting matters here. Neeson grew up Catholic in Northern Ireland, in a place where the divide between Catholic and Protestant communities was not a joke about offense in heaven. It killed people for 30 years. He agreed to voice a priest written as decent and effective in an episode that ends with a brawl between two halves of the afterlife. Whether that reads as bold or as tone-deaf depends entirely on how much of that history a viewer is carrying. Coming up, how the school actually gets through to Bart. Section 53, comic books about saints. In that same 2005 episode, the thing that finally reaches Bart at the Catholic school is reading. Father Sean gives him comic books about the lives of the saints, and Bart is immediately hooked, because those stories are full of violence, defiance, torture, and people refusing to back down in front of authority. He is right, and the show is not joking about it. Saints' lives have worked as reading material for restless children for centuries for exactly that reason. They are adventure stories with stakes. The show noticed something real about how Catholic education actually functions and put it on screen without mocking it. That level of attention is the thing that separates this episode from the quick gags the Catholic League had been objecting to. Somebody in the writer's room knew this material material well enough to identify the specific hook that catches a specific kind of kid. It also sets up the whole problem. Bart is not being tricked or pressured. Nobody is manipulating him. He found something he likes, and it happens to belong to a different church than his mother's, and the adults in his life are about to lose their minds over it. Next, the boy in the confession booth. Section 54, the confession booth. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Guest Star puts a 10-year-old boy in a confession booth and plays it straight. He confesses, he is forgiven, and it works on him in a way nothing else in the series ever has. The scene follows the real form of the sacrament closely enough that Catholic viewers recognized it straight away. Catholic publications discuss this episode instead of denouncing it, largely for that reason. Nothing here is a bit. No cutaway gag underneath it, no undercut, no punchline waiting at the end of the scene. A boy who does bad things constantly is being told, by an adult who means it, that he can be forgiven and start again. Bart decides he wants to become Catholic. Remember that this same show was, at that exact point in its run, still under a standing instruction from its own network about attributing offensive lines to Catholics. 6 years after that note went out, the writers built an episode where the Catholic Church is the only thing in Springfield that gets through to the show's most famous problem child. Then Homer converts too, and it takes about 4 minutes. Section 55. Homer converts over pancakes. Homer Simpson converts to Catholicism in about 4 minutes of screen time in that 2005 episode, and it happens over breakfast. Marge sends him to the school to stop Bart and bring him home. He marches in, ready for a fight. Father Sean sits him down and feeds him a pancake breakfast. They talk. Homer hears about the church's position on gambling and drinking, decides all of this sounds excellent, and converts on the spot. Inside a few minutes of screen time, 2/3 of the show's male cast has become Catholic. Homer is the one being laughed at. His faith is entirely a function, is being handed to him at that moment, and if the pancakes had been worse, he would still be Presby-Lutheran. Nobody watching thinks the show is arguing that this is how conversion works. But the picture on screen is still a father and a son leaving one denomination for another and being visibly happier afterward, and the man who came to stop it stayed for breakfast. The whole episode runs on that shape. Every individual believer in it comes across well, every organization around them behaves badly, and the show never once resolves the tension between those two things. Up next, the 3 people sent to bring Bart back. Section 56, the rescue party. The rescue party in The Father, the Son, and the Holy Guest Star is made up of Marge, Lisa, and Ned Flanders, and they are saving Bart from Catholicism. Ned is horrified, Marge is frightened, Lisa is along for reasons that mostly involve keeping her mother calm. The show stages it like a kidnapping. 3 Protestants chasing after a boy, moving fast, trying to reach him before it is too late, and something permanent happens to him. That framing is the sharpest thing in the episode, and it is played entirely straight. Nobody in Springfield treats this as an overreaction. A child has started attending the wrong church, and the adults in his life mobilize like there has been an abduction. What they use as bait is a Protestant youth festival, which turns out to be almost entirely joyless. The comparison is not subtle, and it is not meant to be. One side has a school that reached a difficult kid, a priest who listened to him, and a ritual that made him feel forgiven. The other side has a field, some folding tables, and a rescue operation. The episode has already decided which of those looks better on camera. Still ahead, a 2-second joke aimed at a named denomination. Section 57, the empty ice cream bowls. One of the cleanest shots this show has ever taken at a named denomination lasts about 2 seconds. At the Protestant Youth Festival in that 2005 episode, a booth is run by Unitarians. They are serving ice cream. The bowls are empty. That is the joke. A denomination widely understood to hold very few fixed doctrines shows up to the party with nothing in the dish, and the gag lands in about 2 seconds without anybody explaining it. The joke names a real church, and the show has rarely taken a cleaner shot at anybody. Nobody protested. No statement, no letter campaign, no press release, no rerun edit. The gag is sharper than it looks. Forget the ice cream. What it mocks is a denomination for holding so few fixed positions that nothing is left to serve. One image, no dialogue, and more pointed than the communion line that started an entire campaign. The comparison with the Catholic material is the point. A quick joke about communion wafers produced a formal complaint, a defense letter from a Fox executive, a mail campaign, an instruction to the writers, and an edited rerun. A quick joke naming Unitarians produced nothing at all because there was nobody standing by to count it. The size of the reaction has almost nothing to do with the size of the insult. It depends entirely on whether an organization exists exists that is built to respond. Coming up, what Bart pictures when he pictures heaven. Section 58. Two heavens, one fence. The scene everybody remembers from The Father, the Son, and the Holy Guest Star is the one where Bart imagines heaven and finds it divided in two. On one side, Protestant heaven is a walled lawn where stiff, pale, wealthy-looking people play croquet and speak in polite murmurs. Nobody is having a good time. Everybody is behaving. On the other side of the fence, Catholic heaven is a party. Music, dancing, a fiesta, food, people enjoying themselves without apology. The wall between them is the Reformation, rendered as garden fencing. That split has produced centuries of war, and the show turns it into a visual gag about which side of the hedge has better catering. For most of the audience, it plays as a straightforward joke about stereotypes, and it is funny because both stereotypes are recognizable. For viewers whose families lived through that division as something other than a punchline, it reads differently. The detail people quote most is that neither heaven is presented as the correct one. Neither heaven is presented as the correct one. The argument is that the fence itself is absurd, an older complaint, and one that plenty of Christians make themselves. Next, what happens on that fence? Section 59. The Brawl in the Afterlife. The divided heaven in that 2005 episode does not stay peaceful for long. They end up fighting. An all-out scrap between the Catholic side and the Protestant side, played for laughs, with the afterlife turning into a schoolyard. Then the episode does something more careful than the setup suggests. Back in the real world, with the adults still shouting over him, Bart points out that they are tearing him in half over labels, while ignoring the one thing all of them supposedly agree on. Everybody calms down. They agree Bart will choose his own religion once he is old enough to choose properly. The ending is reasonable, and it is close to what most religious parents would say they want. Then the show undercuts its own peace treaty with a closing gag about a 1,000-year war in the future. The writers did not believe the argument was over. The truce lasts about 15 seconds of screen time, which is roughly how long these things tend to last outside the show as well. He points out that the adults are fighting over the label on the box while agreeing about what is inside it. A 10-year-old could have delivered that 500 years earlier and saved everybody a lot of trouble. Then Fox pulls the episode off the schedule. Section 60. The week the Pope died. None of this is why the episode is unusual. The unusual part has nothing to do with what is on screen. Fox had it scheduled for April 10th, 2005. Pope John Paul II died on April 2 of that year. The world spent the following week watching coverage of his death and his funeral, and it was one of the largest media events of the decade. Fox pulled the episode off the schedule. Nothing required that. No rule says a network has to clear religious comedy out of its lineup during a papal funeral, and plenty of shows that week carried on as normal. Somebody at Fox looked at the calendar, looked at an episode in which Bart Simpson becomes Catholic, and decided that airing it that particular week would look like a joke aimed at a funeral. It went out more than a month later, on May 15th. That decision matters because it proves the people running this show and the people running the network understood precisely that timing changes what a joke means. They were never indifferent to the effect of the material. They simply drew their line somewhere other than where the complaints wanted it. This is also the only time the network moved a whole episode of this show for religious reasons instead of trimming a line inside one. Fox did not cut anything. It did not soften anything. It just decided the wrong week was the wrong week and waited. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Converting Bart kept the argument inside Christianity between people who mostly agree and disagree about the paperwork. The show had already gone further, in a run of episodes asking whether a human soul is worth more than $5. Section 61. Ned Flanders is the Devil. October 28, 1993. The Devil and Homer Simpson, a segment inside that year's Halloween special, written by Greg Daniels and Dan McGrath, directed by David Silverman. Satan appears in Springfield. The writers could have used any character. They could have invented one, they could have brought back somebody already established as a villain, and the show had plenty of those sitting around. They used Ned Flanders. The most devoted Christian in town, the man who prays before everything, who runs a shop nobody visits because he believes in it, who has never knowingly hurt a living thing, turns out to be the devil. And when Homer reacts, Ned delivers the obvious line about how it is always the one nobody suspects. Handing that role to that character is a joke with a blade in it. The implication, played for a laugh and then dropped, is that the most visibly holy person in any room is the one to watch. The most religious person on any given street understood what was being suggested suggested about them, and the fact that the show never returned to it did not unsay it. Coming up, the price Homer accepts for his soul. Section 62, One Donut. In the 1993 Halloween segment, The Devil and Homer Simpson, Homer sells his soul, not for wealth, not for power, not for youth, or revenge, or a second chance at a life he wasted, which are the terms every version of this story has used for hundreds of years. For a donut, he is hungry, the office has run out, and the devil is standing there with one. Homer signs. The show puts it on an actual contract, has him sign it properly, and then treats the agreement as legally binding for the rest of the story. Nobody argues that it does not count. The paperwork is good. Taking the oldest bargain in Christian storytelling and pricing it at a single pastry is either the funniest possible version of that idea or the most disrespectful one, and both reactions arrived in the mail. The whole thing is in character. Homer would absolutely do this. The show has spent years proving he would. Nothing about it involves trickery, which is the horror of the scene. No trickery was required, and that the devil got a bargain. Up next, what hell has prepared for a man like him? Section 63, The Ironic Punishment. Hell, in the 1993 Halloween segment, turns out to have a department for people like Homer Simpson. They strap him into a machine designed to force-feed him every donut in existence, on the theory that a man who sold his soul for one should be made to suffer through an infinite supply. He enjoys it enormously. He asks for more. The demon operating the machine gives up. That gag is the show's whole approach to damnation compressed into 30 seconds. Hell is real, staffed, and working from a plan, and it cannot do anything meaningful to a man whose appetites cannot be exhausted. The joke is on hell, not on Homer. For a show repeatedly accused of treating religion carelessly, the theology underneath that scene is oddly specific. Punishment only works on somebody capable of regret. Homer has no capacity for it whatsoever, so the machinery of eternal justice runs into a man it simply cannot reach and stalls out. The writers found the one flaw in the entire system, and it turned out to be a fat man from Rhode Island who really likes donuts. Still ahead, the trial that decides where he ends up. Section 64, The Jury of the Damned. The fight over Homer's soul in that 1993 segment ends up in a courtroom because Marge refuses to accept the contract. His lawyer is Lionel Hutz, comfortably the worst attorney in Springfield, a man who has lost cases he was not involved in. The jury is assembled from the damned, historical figures, pulled out of the past for the occasion, sitting in a box in hell to decide whether one man's contract holds. The trial itself is played like a legal drama. Lawyers object. Procedure gets followed. The devil argues his own case, and he is good at it, because of course he is. What the show is doing here is placing the fate of an eternal soul inside the most mundane possible machinery, and the joke is that the machinery works fine. Hell has courts. Contracts get reviewed. The system is functional. Every institution in this series gets the same treatment eventually, and the afterlife turns out to be no exception. Heaven has a fence and a class divide. Hell has a docket and an appeals process. Both of them are run like something you would have to queue at. Then a piece of paper gets him out of it. Section 65, One on a Technicality. Nothing about theology, mercy, or whether Homer deserves a second chance decides that 1993 soul trial. Paperwork decides it. Marge produces a photograph from their wedding day, on the back of which Homer had written that he was promising his soul to her forever. The contract with the devil is therefore invalid because he had already given the thing away years earlier and could not sell what he did not own. Homer walks free on a filing error. That ending is the whole show in one move. The forces of eternal judgment are defeated by a sentimental note on the back of a picture, and the devil, having been beaten fairly, honors the ruling and leaves. The ending is genuinely sweet. Marge's love saves him, which is the most religious idea in the entire segment, and it is also, technically, a loophole. The soul was never redeemed, never repented for, never earned back. The soul was already spoken for, and the court had no choice. The show gets to have the warm ending and the cynical one at the same time, which is a trick it pulls constantly and almost nobody notices. Next, a prank in the same church 2 years later. Section 66, In the Garden of Eden, by Iron Butterfly, October 8, 1995. Bart Sells His Soul, written by Greg Daniels, directed by Wes Archer. It opens inside the First Church of Springfield with a prank. Bart has swapped out the sheet music for the morning hymn, and the congregation begins singing. What they are actually singing is a 7-minute psychedelic rock song from the late 1960s, credited in the show as a hymn written by somebody called Iron Butterfly. They do not notice. They keep going. The organist keeps playing. The congregation works through the whole thing, verse after verse, because the words are printed in front of them, and singing the printed words is what happens at this point in the service. The song they are singing is about a garden in Eden, which is the joke inside the joke. It sounds close enough to scripture that a room half paying attention would never catch it, and the writers picked it precisely because the mistake is completely plausible. Eventually, the organist realizes what is in her hands and stops dead. That gag is the sharpest thing in the episode, and it is over in 90 seconds. A room full of adults sang a rock song about a garden in Eden without registering a single word of it, because nobody in that building has listened to anything they have said on a Sunday morning in years. The joke is not that they are stupid, they are on autopilot. Coming up, how the Reverend deals with the boys who did it. Section 67, Scrub the Organ Pipes. After the hymn prank in Bart Sells His Soul from October 1995, Reverend Lovejoy has to deal with the boys who did it. His response is to make the boys clean the church organ pipes as punishment. That is it. No conversation about why the prank was disrespectful. No attempt to explain what the hymn was for or why replacing it mattered. No question about what the joke revealed about his own congregation. Manual labor, assigned, and then he walks away. A tiny scene, easy to miss, and the clearest single illustration of what the writers decided this character does for a living. He manages behavior. Souls are not part of it. A prank like that is, for any minister actually paying attention, an enormous opening. A 10-year-old just proved that nobody in the room is listening. There is a sermon in that. It is a crisis you address from the pulpit. Lovejoy hands out a chore, because a chore closes the matter and lets him get back to whatever he was doing. The organ pipes get cleaned. Nothing else changes. And the next Sunday, everybody is back in the same seats, reading the same words off the same sheets. Ahead, the 2-second shot that answers Milhouse's question. Section 68. What do religions get out of lying? The sharpest accusation this show has ever made about organized religion lasts 2 seconds and appears in Bart Sells His Soul. Bart declares there is no such thing as a soul and that the whole idea was invented to frighten children. Milhouse is not sure. He asks what religions would actually get out of telling everybody something that is not true, and the show cuts to Reverend Lovejoy counting the collection money. The answer arrives visually, with no dialogue and no comment. A child asks what the church gains from the doctrine, and the camera shows the minister with the cash box. No accusation the series has ever made about organized religion is more direct, and the writers put it in a throwaway 2-second cutaway inside an episode about a boy and his friend. Nothing in the story acknowledges it afterward. Nobody responds to it. The plot moves on to Bart's $5 and never comes back. That is how most of the sharpest material in this show works. The big controversial episodes generate the letters. The 3-second shots buried in ordinary episodes do the actual damage, and they accumulate for 35 years without anybody filing a complaint about any single one of them. Next, the price Bart puts on his own soul. Section 69, $5 Bart Simpson sold his soul for $5 in October 1995. Milhouse made the offer on the reasonable grounds that Bart had just announced the thing did not exist. Bart writes the words on a scrap of paper, signs it, hands it over, and laughs. Then things start going wrong. Automatic doors stop opening for him. His breath no longer fogs a cold window. Animals turn on him. Santa's little helper, who has never once objected to anything Bart has done, growls at him. None of it is confirmed. The show is careful. A mundane explanation is available for every single incident, and the episode never once tells the audience which reading is correct. That ambiguity is why this episode is taught in religious education classes and quoted in sermons, something nobody involved could have predicted. The story works whether the soul is real or whether a 10-year-old boy talked himself into a panic. Both readings hold all the way to the end, and the writers refuse to settle it, which is a more respectful choice than most religious programming makes. Then comes the night that follows. Section 70, On His Knees. The last act of Bart Sells His Soul is a 10-year-old boy who cannot sleep. He has a nightmare in which every other child in Springfield rows away across a lake with their soul sitting in the boat beside them, and he is left standing on the shore alone. He goes looking for Milhouse to buy it back, and finds it has already been traded on for a bag of collectibles. So he chases the paper through the town, getting more desperate at every stop, and eventually he ends up on his knees in his bedroom, praying out loud, asking God to give him his soul back. The boy who spent the episode insisting the soul was a superstition invented to scare children, finishes it begging for his. His prayer gets answered about 4 seconds later. Lisa walks in and hands him the paper. She had tracked it down and bought it herself. Not God, his sister. That substitution is the whole ending. The prayer is answered immediately, and the answer arrives through a person who loves him and went to the trouble. Whether that counts as God working through Lisa or as a sister solving a problem is left entirely open, and the show has no interest in closing it. That ambiguity is why the episode ended up in religious education classrooms. A story that answered the question would only be useful to one side. Then she raises the question the episode has been circling the whole time, which is whether a soul is something a person is handed at birth or something they build slowly by how they live. The show does not answer that one either, and the credits roll. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Souls and devils are safe territory because none of it exists outside the story. The next run of episodes went after religious practices that are running right now, and one ended with a member of the show's own cast using a Simpsons voice to promote a real church. Section 71. The Tent Comes to Town, January 16th, 2000. Faith Off, written by Frank Mula, directed by Nancy Kruse. A traveling revival sets up in Springfield, run by a preacher called Brother Faith, voiced by Don Cheadle. He works the crowd from a stage inside a tent. He calls the sick and the injured forward. He lays hands on them. They are healed, in front of an audience that is cheering and crying and pressing toward the front. The show films it the way this happens on television across America every single Sunday. Same rhythm, same music, same escalating energy in the room, building from testimony to touch to collapse. Nothing about the staging is exaggerated, which is the choice that makes the episode work. The writers did not need to invent anything or push it into parody. They just reproduced the format accurately and let it sit there. For viewers who have never been inside one of those tents, it reads as absurd on its own. For viewers who grew up in that world, it reads as instantly familiar, and that is a much more uncomfortable experience because the joke has not started yet and they are already recognizing the room. Up next, the healing that starts the whole thing. Section 72. The Bucket. The healing that starts everything in Faith Off, from January 2000, involves a metal bucket glued to Homer's head. Brother Faith calls him up onto the stage. Bart gets pulled into the act as an assistant because a child on stage plays well with a crowd, itself an accurate detail about how these events are run. Brother Faith lays hands on him. The bucket comes free. The crowd goes wild. The writers are careful here in a way they did not have to be. It never says whether anything supernatural happened. The bucket was stuck. Now it is not. A perfectly ordinary explanation is available, and the episode does not bother ruling it out or confirming it. What it does show, clearly, is the effect on the room. Hundreds of people just watched a man be healed, and it does not matter to a single one of them whether God did it or a bit of glue gave way. They saw it work, and it does not matter to Bart either. He was standing on that stage when it happened, close enough to feel the noise, and he walks off it convinced that he has the gift. Coming up, what a 10-year-old does with that idea. Section 73. The boy preacher Bart Simpson ran a faith healing ministry in January 2000 in the season 11 episode Faith Off, and the adults of Springfield believed in it. He gets a tent, he gets a stage and a microphone. He starts calling people forward and healing them, and a 10-year-old boy with no training and no supervision begins telling adults that God is working through him. The adults believe him. He cures Milhouse of needing glasses. He gets a college football player back on his feet in time for a big game. He fills seats. The operation grows, and money moves through it, because these operations always involve money and the show does not pretend otherwise. What the episode never does is accuse anybody of fraud. It does not need to. It builds the whole apparatus on screen, puts a child at the center of it, and lets the audience look at the picture. A crowd that wants a miracle badly enough will accept one from a fourth grader, and nobody in that tent stops to ask a single question about credentials. Critics of faith healing have been making that exact argument for 100 years. The show made it in 22 minutes without raising its voice. Still ahead, how the ministry falls apart. Section 74. The leg comes off Bart's healing ministry in Faith Off collapses in the most humiliating way available to it. The football player Bart healed is out on the field during the big game when his leg comes off. The leg was a prosthetic the whole time. Nobody had been healed of anything. The player could always walk, the miracle never happened, and the whole ministry was built on a misunderstanding that everybody involved was too excited to check. Bart's power evaporates the instant the trick is exposed, and the crowd that believed in him 20 minutes earlier moves on without a backward glance. Nobody is angry. Nobody demands their money back. Nobody has a crisis of faith over it. They simply stop attending, the way people stop watching a show that got canceled. The part that stings more than the prosthetic gag, the episode is not saying these crowds are gullible. The point is that they are not especially invested in the answer either way, and that the whole thing runs on excitement that evaporates the moment it becomes inconvenient. Next, the man who becomes a missionary to dodge a phone bill. Section 75. A missionary runs away from public television. February 20th, 2000, 5 weeks later. Missionary. Impossible. Written by Ron Haug. Directed by Stephen Dean Moore. Homer makes a pledge to a public television station during a fundraising drive. He cannot pay it. Rather than deal with the consequences, he flees the country. The escape route he happens to take is a missionary flight, and he ends up on a remote island in the South Pacific as a Christian missionary. He is spectacularly unqualified. He cannot answer the most basic questions about the faith he has been sent to spread. He does not know the stories or the rules. He is there because a plane was leaving, and he needed to be on it. The episode never claims this is how missionary work normally goes. It only needs the audience to accept that a system put him on that plane, and nobody finds that hard to believe. The community he lands in is already functioning perfectly well without him. That premise alone is the argument the episode is making, and it makes it before a single joke lands. A man with no knowledge, no training, and no interest in the people he is meeting has been placed in authority over their spiritual lives purely because he showed up and the system had a seat for him. Then he calls out for Jesus and gets the name wrong. Section 76. Save me, Jeebus. One of the most repeated lines this show ever produced comes from Missionary Impossible in February 2000. Terrified on a plane, Homer calls out for Jesus to save him. He mispronounces the name. What comes out is closer to Jeebus. That single word became one of the most repeated lines the show has ever produced. People print it on shirts. People use it online constantly without having seen the episode it came from and could not name the season it aired in. The name of Jesus Christ got turned into a running gag by the biggest cartoon on television, and it stuck so completely that for a certain generation, the mangled version is more familiar than the correct one. The joke itself is aimed at Homer. He is a man with no religious knowledge whatsoever, panicking mid-air and reaching for a name he has heard but never actually learned, and that is a funny observation about a specific kind of nominal believer. What the writers could not control is where the word went afterward. Once a joke escapes into the language, it stops belonging to the episode. It gets used by people making a different point, aimed at different targets, and nobody involved in writing it has any say in that at all. Coming up, what he builds once he lands on the island. Section 77. He builds a casino sent to a South Pacific island as a missionary in that same 2000 episode. Homer decides the place needs modernizing. He builds a casino. He introduces gambling and alcohol to a community that was doing perfectly well without either, and he does it with total confidence, because in his mind, he is bringing civilization to people who did not have it. By the end of the episode, the society he was sent to help has been visibly damaged, and the damage came entirely from the missionary. That is a direct argument about what foreign missions have historically done to the places they arrived in, and the show makes it plainly in a Sunday night cartoon without softening the landing. The ending refuses to fix it too. Homer does not learn anything and does not repair what he broke. The island is worse off, and the last beat hands the whole mess back to the audience by turning into a joke about public television asking for donations. The man who fled a fundraising drive by becoming a missionary ends up being used as the pitch for a fundraising drive. Nothing about that ending suggests the writers thought missions were harmless, and nothing about it suggests they had a better idea either. Up next, the group that arrives in Springfield promising a spaceship. Section 78. The Movementarians. February 8, 1998. The Joy of Sect. Written by Steve O'Donnell. Directed by Stephen Dean Moore. A group called the Movementarians arrives in Springfield looking for members. They promise a spaceship that will carry the faithful to a better planet. They run a recruitment session designed to wear people down, hours long, with a film, repetition, and no exit until everybody agrees. They take everything the new members own own. Homer joins. The family follows. The compound absorbs most of the town. The recruitment sequence is the most accurate part of the whole episode, and nothing in it is exaggerated for comedy. It matches what people who have left high control groups describe when they talk about how they got in. Nobody argued them into it. They were held in a room until agreeing became the easiest available option. The show stages it exactly that way, and the horror underneath the jokes is that none of the townspeople are stupid. They are tired, and the process is built to make tired people say yes. Marge is the one who gets out first, and the rescue is treated as a genuine deprogramming rather than a gag. Next, the contract they ask people to sign. Section 79, a trillion-year contract. The cult in The Joy of Sect, from February 1998, is welded together out of several real organizations rather than any one of them. Their leader is a distant figure who is barely ever seen. New members sign a contract binding them for 1 trillion years, which is a stretched version of the billion-year agreement signed by members of one real organization's inner order. The group is tax-exempt. It guards its image and has a reputation for going after critics. Pieces of other movements are in there too, in the Spaceship Promise and in the mass recruitment sessions. Blending several real groups into one fictional one was a legal decision as much as a creative one. No single organization could stand up and claim it was being libeled without also standing up and confirming the resemblance. Bart delivers the line that carries the show's actual position. Told he is being moved from a church to a cult, he shrugs and says that either way, he will be bored somewhere on a Sunday. A harder shot at ordinary church-going than anything the cult does in the episode, and it goes by so fast that the spaceship is what everybody remembers instead. Still ahead, a phone call that came from Bart Simpson in real life. Section 80, Bart Simpson Calls Your House. Late January 2009. 11 years after that episode aired, Nancy Cartwright, who has voiced Bart Simpson since the beginning, records a 60-second automated phone call promoting a Church of Scientology event at a venue in Hollywood. She opens it in Bart's voice, saying, "Hey man, this is Bart Simpson," then admits she is kidding and gives her real name. She keeps slipping back into the voice throughout and signs off with Bart's catchphrase about seeing everyone there. Cartwright has been a member of the church since the late 1980s and has donated millions of dollars to it. She also voices Todd Flanders, the younger son of the most devout Christian in Springfield. Algene said flatly that the call was not authorized and that The Simpsons does not endorse and never has endorsed any religion, philosophy, or belief system more serious than a candy bar. That line ran everywhere, from the trades to the wire services to public radio. Fox refused to say whether she would face consequences. Its legal department was reportedly looking at it, and the audio came off video sites under a copyright claim from the studio because the characters belong to Fox and not to the people who speak for them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything so far has stayed inside Christianity, but Springfield also has a Hindu shop owner, a Jewish clown, a Muslim family, and a school board willing to go to court over how life began. Every one of those threads got a reaction, and one got a thank you letter. Section 81, The Clown and the Rabbi. In 1991, the show revealed that Krusty the Clown is Jewish. His real name is Herschel Krustofsky. His father is a rabbi who has not spoken to him in decades because his son went into show business instead of following him into the synagogue. Like Father, Like Clown aired on October 24, 1991, written by Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski, directed by Jeffrey Lynch and Brad Bird. It retells an old story about a cantor's son who chooses the stage, and it ends with Bart and Lisa arguing scripture with a rabbi to reconcile a father and a son. Two children quoting religious texts at an elderly clergyman to talk him into forgiving his kid. Jackie Mason, who had been an ordained rabbi before he became a comedian, voiced the father and won a Primetime Emmy for it in 1992. That episode is still cited as one of the better pieces of religious storytelling on American television, and it did something the show almost never does with Christianity. It took the faith seriously as a source of genuine obligation rather than as a set of buildings and rules to be worked around. The care was not accidental. Two rabbis, Lavi Meyer and Harold M. Schulweiss, were credited on that episode as special technical consultants. The writers brought in working clergy to check the material before it aired. Nobody wrote in afterward. No organization counting jokes, no statement, no complaint. The show had been careful, and being careful worked. Coming up, how far the show kept going with that relationship. Section 82, 30 years of coming back to it. The show kept returning to Krusty's Judaism, and it kept getting more serious about it. In a 2003 episode, he discovers he never had a bar mitzvah and goes through the ceremony as an adult. The ritual itself is played with a straight face, even though everything happening around it is ridiculous. In 2014, his father dies, and the show spends real time on grief, on Jewish burial practice, and on what a son owes a parent who disapproved of him for most of his life. That is 30 years of returning to one religious relationship and treating it with more weight each time. The series never once did that with the church the Simpson family actually attends. Part of the reason sits in the writer's room. American television comedy in the 1990s drew heavily on a Jewish comic tradition, and a great many people writing this show came out of it. Material about a rabbi and his son was handled by people who knew what was at stake in it. The Protestant church down the street was handled by people who sat through those services as children, found them boring, and never stopped finding them boring. Next, the god Homer insults by name. Section 83. When they were handing out gods. Apu Nahasapima has been Hindu since the 1990s, and the show has been consistent about it for decades. He keeps a shrine to Ganesha in the back of the Quick E-Mart. He prays regularly. He is a vegan for religious reasons. He takes his faith more seriously and more consistently than any Christian character in the series except Ned Flanders. Homer looks at the statue in that shop and tells Apu that when the gods were being handed out, his religion got a bad deal. The line is aimed at Homer's ignorance. The staging says so, Apu's reaction says so, and Homer is wrong about nearly everything anyway. The most recognizable cartoon character on Earth still insults a Hindu god by name in that sentence, in front of a global audience, and the god does not get a defense. The show gave Apu a genuine religious life and then used it as a surface for Homer to be stupid against. Both of those things are true at once, and which one a viewer walks away with depends almost entirely on whether that god belongs to them. Then the first Hindu group puts a complaint to Fox. Section 84, the first Hindu complaint. In the middle of the 1990s, a representative of the Federation of Hindu Associations, named Prithvi Raj Singh, objected to how the show was handling Hindu material. A Fox spokeswoman responded that there had been no planned attack on Hinduism, and that was the end of it. No campaign, no mail, no instruction to the writers, no edited rerun. A small incident resolved inside about a news cycle, and the first time an organized religious group outside Christianity ever put a formal complaint to this show, and the outcome is worth setting beside what the Catholic League achieved a few years later. Same network, same show, roughly the same kind of objection, that a faith was being treated carelessly in front of an enormous audience. One group got a statement, the other got a rule change, and nothing about the Hindu complaint was weaker on the merits. Apu's faith had been used as material for years by that point, in front of an audience of tens of millions, and the objection was straightforward. It simply arrived without the machinery required to make a network care. The difference was not the strength of the argument or the seriousness of the offense. The difference was infrastructure. One organization had a mailing list, a press operation, and decades of practice at making networks uncomfortable, and the other did not. Ahead, the argument that finally moved the show 20 years later. Section 85. Proud of Apu. The argument came back much later and much louder. In 2021, after Matt Groening said he was proud of Apu, a spokeswoman for the Hindu American Foundation named Shireen Bala told an entertainment outlet the character is a walking stereotype that leaves Hindus feeling pushed to the margins and has been used to bully Hindu children. That sits downstream of a 2017 documentary by the comedian Hari Kondabolu, which reopened the whole question and eventually contributed to the character being quietly retired from new episodes. The objection there is about ethnicity as much as religion, and the two are tangled together in the character by design. His accent, his shop, his shrine, his arranged marriage, and his vegetarianism were all built into the same package, and the jokes drew on all of it interchangeably. Notice how long it took. The first Hindu complaint arrived in the mid-90s and evaporated. The one that moved the show came more than 20 years later, and not from a religious body at all. It came from a comedian with a camera. Up next, the Muslim family who move in next door. Section 86. The Muslim family moves in. November 30th, 2008. My Pods and Boomsticks. Written by Mark Wilmore. Directed by Stephen Dean Moore. A Muslim family moves to Springfield. Bart becomes friends with their son, a boy named Bashir. Homer decides the family must be terrorists. He has no evidence and no reason. He simply looks at them and reaches the conclusion, then spends the rest of the episode assembling a case out of nothing and convincing himself he has uncovered a plot. He is wrong. The father is a businessman. The plot Homer thinks he has found is a scheduled demolition of an old building. The episode still gets its jokes in, and some of them are aimed at the same target Homer is. He garbles the name of God in Islam into a common English first name. He mangles the name of the Quran into a brand of beer. Those stayed in. The writers did not sand the episode down into something safe. What they did instead was make absolutely certain that the fool in every scene is the man doing the suspecting, and that the family being suspected are the most reasonable people in the room. Coming up, the letters that arrived afterward. Section 87, the thank you letter. What followed the 2008 episode My Pods and Boomsticks had not happened before and has barely happened since. Muslim organizations in the United States thanked them. The Council on American Islamic Relations wrote to Matt Groening about the episode. The Muslim Public Affairs Council gave an award to the guest actress Shohreh Aghdashloo for her performance in it, an episode in which the main character spends 20 minutes being loudly prejudiced against a Muslim family, produced letters of gratitude from Muslim advocacy groups. The reason is not complicated. Those organizations were not being asked to laugh at themselves. They were being handed 22 minutes of prime time in which a national audience watched a bigot be wrong in detail and be shown to be wrong by the end. Very few groups ever get that to get from a comedy, and it is rarer still for a group that spent the years after 2001 being written into American television almost exclusively as a threat. The episode did not ask them to be good sports about a joke. It made the joke on their behalf. Set that next to everything else in this video. The Catholic League got a rerun edit after years of pressure. Hindu groups got a statement and then 20 years of silence. Muslim groups got an episode that argued their case for them and wrote to say thank you. Same show. The difference was whose side the story took. Groups did not object because they were mocked, since nearly everybody in Springfield gets mocked. They objected when the story put them in the wrong and left them there. Next, the church Lisa walks out of. Section 88. Lisa leaves the church. December 16, 2001. She of Little Faith. Written by Bill Freiberger. Directed by Stephen Dean Moore. After Mr. Burns covers the rebuilt church in advertising, Lisa walks out of it. She goes looking for something else and finds a Buddhist temple down the road, where the entire local Buddhist population turns out to be Lenny, Carl, and a visiting Richard Gere. She converts. Gere is a practicing Buddhist in real life, and he set terms before he would record. Buddhism had to be handled accurately. Lisa's conversion had to be permanent instead of being reset by the following week, and a line about freeing Tibet had to appear in the episode. The production took all three, though the Tibet line ended up in Gere's own mouth rather than Lisa's, and she did not say it herself until the following season. Everything else held. Lisa Simpson has been a practicing Buddhist ever since, which makes her one of the only characters in American network television whose religious conversion actually stuck. Paul McCartney had extracted the same kind of promise years earlier to keep her a vegetarian, and the show kept that one too. Guest stars, it turns out, could change this show in ways no religious organization ever managed. Still ahead, a witch trial in a modern American town. Section 89, The Witches of Springfield. In the season 21 episode Rednecks and Broomsticks from 2009, Lisa discovers that 3 young women in Springfield are practicing Wicca, and she starts learning from them. The town reacts the way this town always reacts, which is with a panic that escalates until it looks like a witch trial. Most of the episode's aim is at the people doing the accusing rather than at anyone's religion. The joke is the mob, not the practice. But the show put modern paganism on network television as something a bright, thoughtful child could reasonably be curious about, and did not treat it as inherently ridiculous. Compare that with how the First Church of Springfield gets handled every week. Approaching a religion from the outside, the show is careful and makes the townspeople the problem. Approaching the church the family belongs to, it goes straight for the minister, the collection plate, and the sermon nobody is listening to. Distance produces politeness. Familiarity produces the jokes that got this video made. Then comes the courtroom fight over how life began. Section 90, Evolution Goes on Trial. May 14, 2006. The Monkey Suit. Written by J. Stuart Burns. Directed by Raymond S. Percy. Ned Flanders and Reverend Lovejoy see an exhibit on evolution at the Springfield Museum, decide it is dangerous, and campaign to get creationism taught in the schools. They win. Evolution is banned outright in Springfield. Lisa starts teaching it in secret and gets arrested for it, and the episode turns turns into a restaging of the famous 1925 trial over evolution in Tennessee, with an 8-year-old girl in the defendant's chair. The creationist organization, Creation Ministries International, published a response afterward, arguing that biblical creation had taken the heavier share of the ridicule and that the position had not been given a fair hearing. That is an on-the-record objection from a religious group, and one of the few times anybody answered this show with an essay rather than a press release. They were also, on the narrow point, correct. The episode was never trying to be balanced. It knows which side it is on from the first scene, and it never pretends otherwise. The response did not address that Ned and Lovejoy are not written as villains in that story. They believe they are protecting children. The episode disagrees with them and still lets them be sincere. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Inside America, the worst that happened was letters and one quietly edited rerun. Outside it, the church material got cut before anyone could see it, and one national broadcaster refused to air an episode at all. Section 91. The Simpsons gets rebuilt for Ramadan, October 4th, 2005. The first night of Ramadan, which is the biggest television viewing night of the year across much of the Middle East. The Middle East Broadcasting Center premieres an Arabic version of The Simpsons called Al-Shamshun, dubbed in Egyptian Arabic, with the comedian Mohammed Hannadi voicing the lead. Hannadi was one of the biggest stars in the region. This was not a cheap experiment. Homer became Omar, Marge became Mona, Springfield became Rabea. The project was approved by the network's head of acquisitions, Badi Fatou, and it was a full rebuild rather than a quick edit. 52 episodes were localized. They skipped the early seasons entirely and started from season 4 on the reasonable theory that the show got better once it found itself. Everything about the plan was sensible. Real audience, real money, a real star, a real slot. What nobody involved seems to have worked out in advance is how much of this show is load-bearing and how little of it survives being made appropriate. Coming up, everything they had to take out of it. Section 92. Everything Homer does is removed. The 2005 Arabic version, Al-Shamshun, took the alcohol out first. Duff beer became soda, and every scene set in Moe's Tavern was cut, which removes one of the most used locations in the series. Pork went next. Bacon and hot dogs became beef sausages. Shots of Homer eating pork rinds were removed outright. Donuts became kak, a traditional Arabic cookie. Those 3 changes touch something in almost every episode ever made, because Homer's drinking and Homer's eating are not decoration. They are the character. Al Jean said as much later, pointing out that if the man does not drink and does not eat bacon, he is not Homer. Watching a piece of media get made acceptable does something odd to a person. The list of removals reads like a list of vices, and it is easy to assume that taking them out leaves a cleaner version of the same show. It does not. It leaves a man sitting on a couch with nothing to fail at, which is not a character. Every Homer joke depends on a standard he is falling short of. Next, the religion going the same way. Section 93. They never aired Homer, the heretic. The religion came out of the Arabic Simpsons next. Scenes with Reverend Lovejoy were edited out. The First Church of Springfield does not appear. Krusty's screen time was cut to almost nothing, and his father the rabbi vanished completely, because references to Judaism tend to get stripped from programming made for that market, and they never aired Homer the Heretic. This video opened with that episode. The single most important religion story in 35 years of this show, the one where Homer quits church and argues God into approving it, was simply left out of the package and never dubbed. So consider what that version of The Simpsons actually was. A show in which more than 9 out of 10 episodes touch religion, with the religion taken out. A show built on a man's appetites, with the appetites removed. A church comedy with no church. Every single thing anybody in this video ever complained about had now been deleted, all at once, by people who were not trying to make a point. They were just trying to get it on air. And the choice to skip Homer the Heretic is the one that gives the game away. Somebody sat in a room, went through a list of episodes, and identified that specific one as the problem. Whoever made that call understood what this show was doing with religion, which is more than a lot of its critics ever demonstrated. Up next, how long that version lasted. Section 94. 34 days. Al-Shamshun failed. 52 episodes were localized, and only 34 ever aired. The show was pulled roughly 34 days after it premiered. Audiences in the region who already knew the original found the changes obvious and disappointing. Audiences coming to it fresh did not find it funny enough to stay. Fatou said afterward that it had been fairly received at best, average, and that this had made them reconsider. This whole story has nothing closer to a controlled experiment, and the result says a lot. Somebody took The Simpsons, removed the alcohol, the bar, the pork, and the church, and put it in front of a large audience with a major star attached. What was left could not hold anybody for a month. Every element that got cut was an element that some group somewhere had objected to at one point or another. Removing all of them simultaneously did not produce a more respectful version of the show. It produced something nobody wanted to watch, which suggests those elements were never sitting on top of the show. They were holding it up. Still ahead, the first time a court looked at this show. Section 95. The Russian courts take a look. In 2008, a court briefly ordered the Russian channel 2x2 to stop broadcasting several animated shows, including The Simpsons, after complaints from religious groups. The channel was carrying other adult cartoons at the time, and the complaint bundled them all together. This was not a campaign aimed at The Simpsons specifically. The push was aimed at the whole category. Viewers protested in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The media regulator eventually renewed the channel's license, and the show stayed on the air. Very few government bodies anywhere came close to pulling this show off a national broadcaster over religion, and this is the only time in this video a court got involved at all. It failed. The show survived it. What matters is how it worked, because the American route looks nothing like this. In the United States, offended viewers write to a network and hope. In Russia, the route ran through a courtroom and a regulator with the power to take a channel off the air. It failed in 2008 only because enough people objected in the street. Coming up, the episode a Russian channel refused to run. Section 96. The episode Russia would not show. April 30th, 2017. Looking for Mr. Goodbart airs in America. Written by Carolyn Omine. Directed by Mike Frank Polzino. Homer gets hooked on a mobile game that is an obvious version of a real-world augmented reality craze. He and comic book guy end up wandering into the middle of a Sunday service, still hunting creatures on their phones. Lovejoy asks them to stop. Comic book guy tells him the game is bigger than Jesus. Lovejoy sighs and agrees that this is not a high bar these days. Russian Orthodox clergy objected. An archpriest named Andrei Novikov, who sits on the church's Biblical Theology Commission, called the episode Hollywood propaganda aimed at breaking down Russian society, and asked for tighter control over media. Other church figures wanted the age rating on the show raised. The channel 2x2 declined to air it. Their publicity director said they do not run anything that could compromise the network or stir up controversy. In 35 years, this is the only time that a religious complaint kept an episode of The Simpsons off a national broadcaster completely. Not edited, not delayed, just gone. Then there is the man arrested for doing what Homer does. Section 97. The blogger. In the cathedral. The Russian decision to shelve that 2017 episode looks disproportionate until the context arrives. In September of 2016, a Russian video blogger named Ruslan Sokolovsky had been arrested for filming himself playing that same augmented reality game inside a cathedral in Yekaterinburg and posting it online. He was facing years in prison over it at the exact moment the episode was being scheduled. So this was not a question of taste, and it was not a broadcaster being oversensitive about a cartoon. A live criminal case was running in that country about a man doing the exact thing Homer does in that episode, and a television channel decided it was not worth finding out whether a cartoon counted. Set that against the American side, and the gap is enormous. Records released from the Federal Communications Commission, covering roughly 2008 to 2013, include viewer complaints about The Simpsons on religious grounds, objecting to depictions of Satan, and to content warnings. None produced a penalty. The commission covers a narrow band of obscenity and indecency, and religious offense is not in it. Those complaints went into a file. Next, the one cut the show made without being asked. Section 98. The scene they cut themselves. One more removal, and nobody outside the building asked for it. In She of Little Faith, the Buddhism episode, there was originally a scene in which an Arab man is arrested for firing the rocket that destroyed the church. The joke was that the rocket carried the initials H, J, and S, which belonged to Homer J. Simpson, and which happened to match the name of the man the police grabbed instead. The episode was produced shortly after the attacks of September 11th, 2001. The staff pulled the scene out of concern about what it would do to Arab viewers in that particular autumn. Nobody complained. No network note came down. No organization counted anything. The writers looked at what they had drawn, thought about the month it would air in, and took it out. That single decision undercuts both of the standard arguments about this show at once. They were not fearless people who never softened anything. They were also not reckless people who never considered consequences. They cut a joke that would have hurt a group being attacked in in the street that year, and they kept every joke about the church. Ahead, the newspaper that tried to claim Homer Simpson. Section 99. The Vatican claims Homer Simpson. December 2009. The Simpsons turns 20, and the Vatican's own newspaper runs a tribute. L'Osservatore Romano describes the show as tender and irreverent at once, philosophical, and at points even theological. On Homer, it argues that he keeps turning to God as a last resort, and that although he gets the details spectacularly wrong, these are small mistakes between two figures who know each other well. Then it goes further. On October 16, 2010, the Jesuit journal La Civiltà Cattolica publishes a 9-page article on the show by Father Francesco Occhetta. The next day, the Vatican paper runs it under a headline stating that Homer and Bart are Catholic, opening with the claim that few people know it and he hides it well, but Homer Simpson is Catholic. Occhetta himself pushed back on that framing afterward, saying the interpretation belonged to the newspaper and that he had never claimed it. Al Jean's response is the funniest document in this entire video. He said he was in shock and awe that it made up for 20 years of not going to church, then pointed out that Homer could not go without meat on a Friday for an hour. Coming up, the church groups who teach this show on a Sunday. Section 100. The church teaches it on Sunday. Mark Pinsky, the reporter who wrote the St. Flanders cover, turned his research into a book called The Gospel According to the Simpsons, published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2001. Then he wrote a companion study guide with a United Methodist pastor named Samuel Parvin, published by the same press in 2002. It runs 10 sessions for church groups, each pairing an episode with scripture and discussion questions. Homer the Heretic is on the syllabus. So is the episode that opens with children being frightened about hell in a Sunday school classroom. Congregations sat in church basements, watched those episodes, opened their Bibles, and talked about them, using a guide written by a working pastor. The same happened in schools. Bart Sells His Soul, the episode that opens with a congregation unknowingly singing a rock song as a hymn, became a teaching tool in religious education classes in Britain and America. A minister in Scotland built a sermon around it. 100 moments, 35 years, and it never resolved. The show that sent the Simpson family to hell on Easter Sunday is the one religious teachers hand to their students. The man who sold his soul for a donut is the one the Pope's newspaper tried to claim. The reason both things stayed true is simple enough once the whole list is laid out. This show never argued that God does not exist. In Springfield, God is real, heaven is real, hell is real, and prayers get answered. What it went after was everything people built on top of that, which is the same complaint reformers have been making from inside the church for centuries. That is why a Jesuit journal could write 9 pages claiming this family. That is why an evangelical magazine put The Neighbor on its cover, why Muslim groups sent letters of thanks, and a Methodist pastor built a course out of it, and why the Catholic League counted the jokes, a Russian archpriest got an episode pulled, and a broadcaster in the Middle East cut the church out entirely. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.